Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was January 8th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico. And this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today we're looking at another in a series of short, rapid-fire missives that Violant is sending out from Barcelona right at the outset, the initial days of being queen. This letter is at the bottom of the folio, and so you have to go, I think it's like 4 letters down, and on the very last line, you'll see dirigit gubernatori Majorcorum. And that means directed to the governor of Majorca. And this letter is basically summoning the agent of the Crown of Aragon, someone who I think can help to situate the concerns of Majorca to Joan and Violant once he arrives to Barcelona, basically just summoning him to show up and make connection and to understand what the new monarchs might want with Majorca. I don't know that the new monarchs want anything in particular from Majorca except to just, keep things calm and don't, have any trouble. There hasn't been much trouble in Majorca for a few years. And so Majorca is not exactly a hotspot like Empúries is. So it's not quite clear to me why this is seemingly high priority along with the letters about Empúries, but Majorca does have a history of being kind of a troublemaking territory in the Crown of Aragon. And so I'm going to pull back and actually talk a bit about the history of the Crown of Aragon in order to help you understand a little bit about the political entity that we've been talking about, and to also understand a little bit more about how Violant and Joan fit into the larger operation of the region of the Mediterranean. The origin of the Crown of Aragon goes back to the 12th century. And this political entity forms in the context of the weakening of Muslim rule over Iberia. The person who was in charge of the Crown of Aragon at the time that Majorca was conquered, that was King James I, known as the Conqueror. And James I also led troops into Valencia and conquered Valencia. Both Majorca and Valencia had been under Muslim rule for centuries, and this is in the early 1200s that James I is doing this. Majorca is conquered by James I in 1229, and Valencia in 1238. And something to keep in mind about the long-lasting Muslim rule in Iberia is that when James conquers Valencia. That ended 527 years of Muslim rule of that part of Iberia. Now, I start out the podcast every time by emphasizing that it's been 639 years between our present time, now in 2026, and the time that I'm talking about, centuries in the past with Chouan and Violant and their reign. But keep in mind that the scale of Muslim rule in Iberia is just as vast as the time between now, 2026, and looking at 1387. So the reason that I'm emphasizing this is to really put the focus on how Muslim culture and Muslims themselves were really in Iberia for generations upon generations upon generations. In whole parts of Iberia, it was just natural to see that part of the world as part of the Muslim world, Dar al-Islam. So in the process of the weakening of these polities, the Muslim political states that had, at this point, when Jaume, that's the Catalan name for James, when James the Conqueror started to pick off these territories, the division between the different leaders, different Muslim leaders around, actually created a weakness that was an opportunity for Christian military leaders like James to conquer. So the expansion of the Crown of Aragon is very much part of the interfaith encounter in the Mediterranean between Muslim polities and Christian polities. I'm about to talk a little bit more about the interaction between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in medieval Iberia. But before I do that, I want to mention something about James and the territory of Valencia, because it relates to the archive of the Crown of Aragon and the very material that we're looking at when we look at documents in the registers, like today's document. There's a town to the south of Valencia, not too far south. It's named Játiva. Játiva is a town that specialized in paper making, and it made gigantic amounts of paper and supplied the merchants and politicians of the Muslim territories around there with paper. And this paper making technology had been diffused, had been passed along all the way from China and through all the different Muslim territories, from the Levant to North Africa and then to Iberia. By the time James arrives and conquers Valencia, the paper making from Játiva had been going on for quite a while, and it continues. That is one of the reasons why we have all these records in Iberia. It's so uncommon in other parts of Western Europe, because in other places in Western Europe there wasn't paper-making technology. And so the records that exist are on parchment, which is way more expensive to produce. Parchment is basically, it's animal hide. And so it's way more difficult to produce parchment in large quantities than it is to produce paper. So the abundance of paper is one of the reasons why a culture of record keeping really flourishes in the Crown of Aragon. And by the time we get to 1387, there's so much record keeping that's happening just as a matter of course, and was allowed to grow and grow and grow, especially in the 14th century, because of this original supply of paper. So what we are looking at in material terms is the result of Muslim influence. We have these records because of paper making technology developing in all these different parts of the Muslim world, way ahead of when it entered into what could be called Christendom. Another piece of the puzzle here is that James himself was, for a formative part of his childhood, a ward of a high-up official in the church who basically was in close correspondence with the Pope a whole lot. And as James was a ward of this papal legate, he had a chance to observe the chancery operations at a high level for the papacy. And so that allowed him to, when he became king, institute this regime of record keeping as a way to bolster his own authority and to hold those who he made deals with accountable. A paper record, a documentation record, will help you to establish your authority and to basically be a way of legitimating a lot of what you're doing. So the reason that we have the Archive of the Crown of Aragon in such abundance has so much to do with this overall story of the development of the Crown of Aragon and the personal qualities of James the First, and then his ability to basically create the military expansion of his territorial claims in the early 13th century. But a lot of people make the mistake of viewing this period of time, this transition, in terms of a clash of civilizations, that there was like a front line between Christians and Muslims, and that it was just kind of like this battle, and bit by bit the Christian forces reconquer Iberia, in the term used is Reconquista. This is only a fraction of an accurate view of what was going on historically, because the real frame to view this with, if you want to imagine what was going on in this past time, is that there was just as much cooperation as there was conflict. So there are so many areas of Iberia in which Muslims and Christians and Jews are getting along and really cooperating a whole lot. That is known as the convivencia. That is a term that came up as an effort to present the time, especially under Muslim rule, of a kind of ideal of multiculturalism that was, I think, highly valued in the context of when those historians were writing in the 19th century, 20th century. So that also is an error, to think that there was always peace between the three major religious groups in Iberia. And so Brian Catlos has come up with another term, conveniencia, meaning that the interfaith encounters could be characterized by a kind of pragmatic interaction, that Jews and Muslims and Christians, they did business with each other when it made sense, that it was more of a kind of pragmatic interaction with, hey, you know what, if we can go into business together and benefit each other, let's do it. If there's no real incentive here, we're not gonna move forward, and we'll just kind of keep to our own neighborhood or keep to our own town. So even as the conquering is taking place, there's really interesting mixtures of cooperation and conflict. So, for example, it was common when Christian military leaders were fighting against some Muslim realm, the Christians, would have Muslim allies. And vice versa. Sometimes Christians would ally with Muslims fighting other Christians based on the self-interest that they had for their own political goals. So there's a real mixture here in terms of motivations and shifting alliances and economic cooperation versus economic competition. The Crown of Aragon is called the Crown of Aragon. It's got the word crown in there as sort of a nod to how this was more of an alliance of different polities than it was a centralized state. The whole idea of a state at this time in the Middle Ages is very different from what we imagine the state to be in our time and what governance and government looks like in our time. So referring to this state as the Crown of Aragon is a very helpful reminder, I would say, for a lot of the polities in the Middle Ages, that what we're talking about is not some kind of government that's able to get its tentacles into all these different regions of the Mediterranean, but instead we're talking about a lot of deal making, a lot of centrifugal force that is leading different parts of the realm to get interested in splitting away occasionally, but that the major thing holding them together is, I think, an economic growth framework, where if you are connected in terms of who you are being ruled by in a sort of confederation sense, then it makes certain trade interactions more smooth because you're all operating with maybe similar understanding of how the ports operate, what the customs are going to be, customs in terms of the taxes, but also in terms of just how to go about doing business. And I think that a lot of the reason for the increasing Catalan presence in the Mediterranean at this time has to do with how the people who were part of the initial Crown of Aragon, they understood that they had to operate in a very multilingual and multi-political context, where they had to be able to communicate with others across language barriers and cultural barriers all the time. A lot of this has to do with the origins of the original entities in the Crown of Aragon, which basically are going along the coast, the southern coast of what is today Spain and France. And in that region, I would say stretching from Montpellier to Barcelona, there's just a tremendous diversity in language groups and cultures. Part of it is because of the Pyrenees Mountains interrupting contact in some of the times that these vernacular languages developed out of Latin. Speaking of language, Some of you might be curious to know about the language Catalan and also how that influences the names of people like Joan and Violant. So I'll talk just a little bit about that. Catalan, the way I like to think of it is if you took Castilian Spanish and French and put them into a blender and then threw in a lot of words with the letter X. Because it really is, if you study Castilian Spanish and French, you can kind of figure out a lot about Catalan, but it is its own thing, and I don't want to make it seem like it's some kind of like derivation, because it comes up along with other languages like Occitan in the south of France. There's all these variations like a spectrum that go all along from Portuguese to French. And it's really a beautiful array of different linguistic developments and practices. So, Catalan is its own language, very much so. It's got its roots going all the way back to initial Latin and then splitting off just as modern-day French or modern-day Castilian Spanish split off. Catalan has some different pronunciation tendencies, or I guess you could say patterns. And so that's why we have, instead of like a soft I'm not a very good linguist, so I'm not describing this right. But instead of a Johann, we have a Joan. And also we can say Violant is the Catalan version of Yolanda. Violant was named Yolanda after her grandmother. And remember, Violant is from France. And she's named after Yolanda of Flanders. So the name Yolanda has a very long history of usage at this time. Another part of the pronunciation piece here is Aragon. So there's another language called Aragonese, which is similar to Catalan but has distinct differences. I feel like every time I say Aragon, I say it differently. Like sometimes it's Aragon, sometimes it's Aragon. And that is just a legacy of how in the Anglophone world of medieval scholarship, it's very common to hear people in the United States call this region Aragon. And so I've heard it Aragon all the time. I think that, the actual pronunciation is more like Aragon. But I just am all over the place on that. So if you've been listening closely to me, you've probably noticed, why is Jonathan saying this differently like almost every time? It's because I have not settled on any kind of one way to say it, so I just switch it up. Goodness gracious, we have gone so far over the goal time for these episodes. Got really into a lot of the background context. I hope that that was interesting to everybody. And yeah, I mean, we've got a little document here about Majorca that then you can use as just the tip of the iceberg, talking about Majorca, and it takes you into all these other areas of what was happening at this time and how what had been going on for centuries leads into this moment in the archive on January 8th, 1387. Well, thanks for bearing with all of that. Of course, there's still all the different kinds of questions that come up about the document and why is Majorca such a big deal right now? Is it just always a big deal? Is there anything happening right at the moment? Not sure, have to research that a little bit more, but we'd better just bring this episode to a close. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, maybe you got some questions answered about some of the historical context, but you're mad because you want to know more about what happened in Majorca at this time, well, take that anger and transform it into a love of how you never really get to know everything about what's going on in the past. And remember that this means I've done my job. The motto of the Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. For that reason. So visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.